Are we filming?
Sure.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you have all had a restful and relaxing Earth Day weekend. And I would like to welcome you all to this third live in-person America's Public Forum event of the year 2023, hosted by the Braver Angels DC Project with incredible support from the Braver Angels DC Alliance, here from downtown Washington, DC at the Hamilton Restaurants Loft venue. I appreciate everybody joining us this evening, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with two minds I admire and have learned a lot from, and I hope that we can pull some further thoughts from those minds. But in the meantime, let me just make a couple very quick introductions, and then we will get started and get rolling. So, for those of you who have not been to events with Braver Angels or in the Braver Angels community yet, welcome. Braver Angels is the nation's largest fully bipartisan red-blue grassroots and citizen-led civic organization dedicated to helping Americans find value in each other across all of their divides, political, cultural, social, etc., etc., etc. We do that with a variety of means. Most of them involve some version of having people sit around in circles and talk about their feelings according to various formats, and we believe entirely that if you can bring the right spirit and submit yourself to the right standards and procedures, it is possible to talk about just about anything, and that doing so is not necessarily the thing that will save the American Republic, the American experiment, but it certainly is something that is necessary to whatever salvation of that American experiment will be there. And we at Braver Angels and everything we do are dedicated to doing that across all lines of difference. So, here in Washington, DC, here in the nation's capital, Braver Angels works to engage with various members of the policy community in that crucial, perhaps Tocquevillian, perhaps Madisonian, depending on what your particular preferences are, style of work. And we do it in ways that stay true to that old spirit, but also are of use to the most pressing issues of the day. And additionally, whenever we can, we do our best to try to take whatever expertise and insights and understandings we can from the greatest intellectuals in policy world on their long reflections and mullings and musings on the multiplicitous aspects of polarization as a phenomenon. And that's exactly what we're going to do here tonight. That's exactly the mission of the America's Public Forum program. And that's what I am looking forward to spending the next couple hours here doing. So the theme tonight, you might have noticed, is quite broad, quite historically focused, and there's a reason for that. Is it's a broad topic, and the two folks that I brought here to discuss it are what Isaiah Berlin would have called foxes rather than hedgehogs. They have multiple avenues of understanding this complex topic that reaches down and hits all of us at the very basis of our lives. So, but I'm going to start off just by posing the question, right? Is our polarization nowadays, in the 21st century, in the age of post-Trump, post-COVID, perhaps pre-Trump, pre-COVID, we shall see, is political polarization in the 2020s meaningfully distinct, meaningfully different from political polarization at previous times in American history, namely the mid to late 20th century, which still informs much of our institutional and political thought. To what degree is it? To what degree is it not? And on what wavelengths is it, and on what wavelengths is it not? We have a tendency, I think, in a lot of high journalism to look at various decades as being something resembling golden decades on various measures. A lot of people will look to the 1950s on questions of social cohesion. A lot of people will look, I guess, to the 1930s and 40s on levels of major public projects. A lot of people will look to the 1960s and 70s in terms of what is possible in public progress, and a lot of people will look to the 80s and 90s in terms of what prosperity looks like at a vast national level. And this is all good, and the relationship of polarization in each of those times to those aspects that we remember is probably interesting to suss out in itself too. But all that being said, we have a certain kind of historical memory of the 20th century being meaningfully less divisive than ours was. And I think as any historian of the 20th century, or frankly of any time can tell you, there were real divides and real factors at those times that are still worth looking at, and the way we remember those should be something that those of us who study polarization, those of us who are activists in the world of depolarization, and those of us, or those of you rather, who will perhaps someday be the wise philosopher kings building the new modes and orders which will diminish polarization, perhaps. Those are how we remember the past is an important thing. And so to go through some of these questions, I am excited to be joined by two people who have influenced some of my thought on this, and I think they can help us think this through some more too. So first, furthest to my right is Geoffrey Kabaservice, the Director of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center and the author of various books on 20th century politics, including one called The Guardians about the great transformation of Yale and higher education, and another one called Rule and Ruin about the long decline of the moderate Republican faction of the Republican Party. Geoff Kabaservice focuses on a lot of questions of the constellations of party politics in the 20th century, and a lot of questions of how the various factions of the WASP elite conceived of themselves and acted in the great institutional transformations in the 70s and 80s and so. And I'm excited for him to join us here. So Geoff, thanks for being with us here. I'm also joined just to my center here by Adam Garfinkle. Adam Garfinkle is presently a member of the editorial board of American Purpose magazine. And he also was the founding editor of another old magazine called The American Interest, which, in my opinion, still remains the great golden light of what enlightened public discourse informed by good sociological scholarship is capable of in Washington, D.C.'s intellectual circuits. And Adam thinks about everything and writes about it too. But in particular, he has a very unique sociological approach to American public discourse questions and how that relates to American citizens amid American democracy, which he's written a couple of ebooks on now. And those ebooks, I still go back and read them every once in a while, and they're fascinating. I'll ask you for the title in just 1 second here. And Adam is here with us as one of the great minds thinking about these as well. So Adam, Geoff, thank you for joining us for this event. Now if I'm thinking about this right, the title of the one from 2011 was "What's Wrong and How to Fix It: An 11-Step Guide to Thinking About American Political Dysfunction."
It was called Broken, and then there was a colon, and then there was all the other stuff. It's called Broken. That's an old book.
I think it's still relevant in a couple of ways, but we'll go into those ways in just 1 second here. I want to start off with just one preliminary question, and you two can both take up to 5 minutes or so to think about to respond however you like. But this basic preliminary question is: what was the state of American divisions, the state of American polarization like over the 20th century for in the times that mattered, and how does it differ from American polarization in our own times after the end of history, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s? What's the best way we should think about the differences between polarization in the 20th century and the 21st century? And feel free to extrapolate on that however you like. Adam, Geoff, would you like to?
Adam, go ahead.
Okay.
Well, that wasn't exactly the topic that I thought we were going to be talking about. That's my fault, not yours. I mean, there have always been divisions within American society, and they've ceaselessly changed over the 200 and some years since the country got put together and became independent and so on. But I do think that what's the divisions we're seeing today are qualitatively different and have some different causes than the sort of the run-of-the-mill sources of polarization in the past. You mentioned the 20th century, but I think the greatest divisions in American history go back before that. They go back really to probably the period of bloody Kansas, the period from the time when the Whig Party collapsed in 1852 due to the death of both Henry Clay and Daniel Webster up through the beginning of the Civil War. That seems to me to be probably the worst case you can sketch. Then, of course, back even before that war of 1812 and the Mexican War, there was such division that New England threatened to secede from the Union over some of those events. That tends to get read out of the history that we teach the kids, But those were pretty serious divisions, and they were serious. Those were serious threats. A threat to the Union, in other words, was always on the minds of the founding generation and the generation after it, and for good reason, because the Union, of course, did collapse and had to be put together by force of arms. That's the way it happened. As for the 20th century, it seems to me that you have to think about it in at least two ways. What constituted the social glue or the social trust that kept America as a single political going concern, a single political unit? And then what was the broader regional and international context that weighed upon the United States? So one thing's obvious. During the Cold War and the lead up to the Cold War, the long crisis of the Cold War, there was, in the imagination of the American public and elite, I think rightly so, a concern with the national security crisis. And since 1991, and even really after 9/11, 2001, we haven't had that same sense of siege or same sense of national security crisis. And I think the context, everything has a context, right? The context is very important in understanding what glue there is or isn't in holding the country together. The other thing, W.H. Brands, a historian at the University of Texas, wrote a book called The Strange Death of American Liberalism. Unfortunately, he published it just in advance of 9/11, and he made the case that in times of national security crisis, perceived national security crisis, trust in central government in the United States, a rare commodity, if you go all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion and the Shays Rebellion and just about everything since, and lately, of course, that tends to strengthen trust in the federal government. And when that happens, the federal government can then do other things with that trust that it couldn't otherwise do. So he argues, for example, that the civil rights movement and the legislation of the middle and into the 1960s would not have been possible had there not been a Cold War and a national security crisis, because it enhanced the level of trust in the government to do the right thing. In other words, it's seamless. Trust is seamless, and a wise or intelligent or skillful government knows how to deploy that trust in various policy areas. Another thing I think is very important to understand is that this is kind of a focus that I've maintained for several decades. You have to think about the technology. You have to think about the way that technological innovation changes social structures, changes the political economy, changes the relationships that people have to one another and to the greater and to the whole. And we've been reading about depletion of social trust, bowling alone, since Robert Putnam first put pen to paper. I think it was back in 1995. And I don't think things have gotten a lot better since he did. So you can point to all sorts of reasons why there is political polarization in the country right now. And some of them are different from before, and some of them are not. And just to run down a very, very quick list, and I'm sure Jeff will do the same or do something similar. We have gerrymandering. That contributes to polarization. We have a lot of non-competitive congressional districts, so the activists in primaries are very important in pushing things to an extreme. That wasn't the case before the middle 1970s. We have a situation where the presidential system itself, which is, you need a majority to win the White House. Juan Linz, in the very first issue of the Journal of Democracy, argued that presidentialism itself, because it's a winner-take-all kind of deal, tends to focus on the zero sum, which accentuates differences among political parties and charismatic candidates. We have imported the culture wars into our politics, for better or for worse. I would argue more for worse. And these are not the kind of issues you can log roll and compromise on. These are issues, these are creedal issues, moral issues. So to the extent that culture war issues, whether it's about homosexual marriage or whether it's about abortion or whether it's about gender issues, all these things, the extent that they become national issues, they tend to toxify the political discourse and make it less civil than it otherwise would have been. We also have, Jeff knows this better than me, we used to have a time when we really didn't have a two-party system de facto in this country. We had a four-party system. We had Democrats who didn't agree with each other. We had Dixiecrats and liberal Democrats and Western Democrats. And in the Republican Party, we had liberal Republicans from New England. We had moral majority Republicans from border states. We had libertarian Republicans from the more Western states. And the only time that these parties had to come together to actually create a national platform was when there was a presidential, and once every 4 years, in other words. Lee Drutman makes this argument, I think, pretty well in one of his papers. So we really had a lot of diversity within the parties, but now, I think it's been 15, 20 years, the parties have spread apart, and there's a lot of blue sky in between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. There's no overlap. So that tends to make the parties homogeneous within themselves and push them more toward their their own guardrail, their own extreme, and it makes it harder for the parties to cooperate because they really don't see any very little common ground, and that's how politics becomes a form of war. Essentially, it becomes almost Leninist, and I think that's quite different. But I think the most important thing, and I'll stop here, even though I can talk about this for days. Oh, another sort of simple thing. It's when the Congress doesn't function very well and it can't get work done, and that's been the case for a while now for a variety of reasons. It tends to pull the executive branch and the judicial branch into more contentious political kinds of decisions and concerns. In particular, the judiciary. The courts have become very political, and that has redounded to the disadvantage of the reputational capital of the courts, and it's weakened the courts, in my opinion. So there are all these reasons that anybody can cite just from looking at the extant literature as to why we have, on the level of institutional behavior in American politics, we have more polarization. But I think the real secret, not secret, because I'm going to tell you what it is, so it won't be a secret anymore, right? I think the real important thing here is what's going on below the visible part of the iceberg, what's going on in the culture. And again, I only have like another 8 seconds on it.
I'll actually ask
what's going on, just very briefly, is that we have a return in spades of a zero-sum mentality. You can see it almost everywhere. And I've got about 7 or 8 reasons I've ticked off as to why it's happened. Some has to do with the economy, some has to do with the nature of the technology, but we now live in a winner or loser, winner take all, my way or the highway, very much two-valued, Manichaean way of thinking about politics. It's become like a blood sport, all right? There are lots of contributing causes to this, including the media environment, the clickbait media environment, which exaggerates the extremes and feed off each other like in an echo chamber. But I think the most important reason, and one that's the least commented on, is the fact that the American people marinate themselves in spectacle entertainment to the point where a lot of people, especially those who don't have a deep reading habit, can no longer distinguish a line of reasoning about events in the real world that is any different from a grade B television or movie plot. They just can't embrace complexity, and this is what explains to some extent the spread of conspiracy theories in our politics, the venom and the obscenity that certain political factions use in language. It's almost like they're in a reality TV script and they can't get out of it. And of course, the best evidence of all for the consequence of it, we had a president, I don't like to mention his name, we had a president who was a reality TV star and someone who got their start in World Wrestling, he's with the World Wrestling Federation Hall of Fame, for God's sake. I mean, he's been a spectacle, two-headed cow faker for the past 25 years, and that's not unusual. We've had a lot of magnificos and people like that in American politics, from Big Jim Folsom and what was his name in Louisiana? Huey Long, right? But none of them got near the White House. The American people actually elected this guy. That's what's different, and I think that's because the culture is so suffused in this fantasy spectacle entertainment that it's not the content of it that matters. It's the form, it's the structure, it's the nature of rules of evidence and logic, right? That's also contributing to the instrumentalization of facts and truth, right? Anything can go in reality TV. You know, the episode ends. It's like a video game. You know, the guy dies, you push another button, he's alive again. I mean, people no longer can distinguish as clearly as you might think this fantasy world from the real world. Model. So you know, you've all heard the phrase. Last thing I'll say: life imitates art, right? Well, it turns out that life also imitates very bad art. That's where we are. And I think that is as I say, the secret ingredient that courses through all of the obvious political institutional reasons for the polarization. I think the real problem is much deeper in the culture.
Adam, you've given us 7 or 8 of the reasons why American political polarization now is different than American political polarization then, and I intend to go to most of them over the course of this conversation. And I appreciate you giving us all the answers up front so that we can
Oh, that's not all the answers, Luke.
Well, I will learn some of them soon. I'm particularly interested actually in the notion that the fundamental American political divide is regionalist and opens up questions that were present in the 18th and the 19th century, and the ways that pours into the 20th and 21st century. We'll chat about that over time. Meantime, Jeff, the same question goes over to you. What is different about polarization in the 20th and 21st centuries? You're welcome to give us all of the reasons down to the very fundamental ones if you like, or you can give us more mundane ones as well, whichever you prefer.
Well, thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Adam. I think Adam gave a lot of those reasons. I would endorse everything you said. Thanks for everyone for being here tonight. Like Bravers Angels, I'm looking forward to the National Convention in Gettysburg in July. I think that'll be a good time. I do live down to your description that Isaiah Berlin channeled through Archaeolocus. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. I think you ought to have a hedgehog-fox debate, because unfortunately I am kind of in the fox camp along with Adam. I mean, I'm just estuarial in my breadth and lack of depth. But I do have certain subjects I've been interested in, and one of them, from very early in my career as a historian, was the view of college students. Because I was myself a college student, and it was a lot easier to think about American history through that lens than to try to give some oracular perspective on the centuries of American history. And one thing I found out is that college students always look back to some earlier era as having been this bygone golden era. So in the 1950s, students were obsessed with the 1920s. They would show up to football games dressed in raccoon skin coats and the hip flasks. Maybe the hip flasks haven't changed, but you know, by its time, the late 60s, early 70s, surprisingly, those students are imitating greaser hipsters from the 1950s. By the time it's the 1980s, students are obsessed with the 1960s. This is not a wholly envious look at the 1960s, but just sort of a sense like that was in a momentous time. There was this failed social revolution. We're still working through the consequences of that. I don't know if people look back now to the 90s or 2000s, but I expect that to some extent there's this kind of belief that things were better. And this also holds true, I think, to some extent in politics. It's always easier to overlook the extent to which conflict has been a constant in American history. But nonetheless, you can say that sometimes we're better and worse than others. Obviously, the 1850s were a terrible time, and you know, one of the reasons that scholars like Rachel Kleinfeld are making such a big splash now is she's pointing out all the ways in which our politics nowadays resemble that of the 1850s. And you know, by the same token, you mentioned Robert Putnam. I really liked his book, The Upswing, that he wrote with Shaylin Romney Garrett. But on the other hand, like, that is making the point that, look, America in the Gilded Age had equally problematic politics in some way, with tribalism and corruption and a lack of social trust. And we gradually, over the course of 70 to 80 years, built up all of these different indices. Americans trusted their neighbors more, they trusted the political process, they trusted experts, and that reached a zenith in the late 1960s, and it's been all downhill ever since. That doesn't necessarily tell you how we get back up, or if we can get back up, but it at least is something worth considering. Now, the question about how things were in other times always also asks, well, who would you get to be in those other times? You know, if you go back to the Middle Ages and you're king, that's certainly different from if you're a peasant. And I think none of us, for all our desire to do time traveling, would want to go back to the 1950s style of medicine. And I think we would all find it immensely poorer, more violent, greater exception of sort of casual cruelty toward children, toward animals, as well as the kind of things that people tend to think nowadays, the discrimination against women, against minorities, against racial minorities, as well as sexual minorities. You can kind of go on down the list. Nonetheless, as a student of moderation, I do look back to those middle decades of the American 20th century with considerable nostalgia, because whatever else you can say about the broader culture, that was a time when politics seemed to work better. And even if you could point to all of the bad things that I mentioned, there was hope on the part of the American people that things would get better. And that's part of the Putnam analysis too. There actually was a tremendous amount of improvement and optimism in the black community about how they would fare in the 1950s, despite the fact that conditions were objectively so much worse in so many ways. And that's not how things feel now. And I think, I do come back to this subject. I think it's because the habits of moderation have been lost. They've been lost among our political leadership, but to some extent they've also been lost amongst the people themselves. And all of the things that Adam mentioned, particularly the gerrymandered primaries, I think is accurate. But also there was a habit of deference on the part of the leadership toward the desire of members of Congress to represent the interests of their district. And those representatives typically would understand that the people in their district didn't agree with each other on everything. Very rarely did you find absolute homogenous districts in any kind of opinions or representatives. Historically, the governors of the states have been among the most moderate elements, and you still find that to some extent because they know that they have to balance the interests of urban and rural areas, of industry and labor, of agriculture and small business. You can kind of go on down the list. But increasingly there is a desire not to do that kind of balancing. And that balance, however you define it, has been lost. Some members of Congress strike me as unbalanced in the clinical sense. And there are incentives that reward them for that lack of balance. And this is just something that I worry about a lot in the culture. And again, you can point to any number of factors, including all the ones Adam mentioned. When I talked to older members of Congress about what had changed, what they would typically point to is the fact that before jet travel, members of Congress had to move to Washington, D.C. They did not go home on the weekends. They brought their spouses and their families here. They grew up together. They belonged to some of the same clubs and associations. They knew each other. They dealt with each other as human beings. And having done that, there are limits on the abuse to which you can subject your colleague. A lot of these people had fought together in World War II. They knew some of the same people they'd lost. They had that same experience of that broadening war. And that profoundly affected their outlook as well. And you can go down the list of the ways in which these things have changed, how people nowadays don't even talk to their colleagues on committees, how they just look at the televisions, how of course they're gone most of the time, how they make a sort of fetish over not really being here when they're here, how actually wanting to govern on the Republican side is a huge liability at this point. And I think these things ultimately are not sustainable. I can't tell you how we will come out of this or if we'll come out of it, but I think the prospects for recovering that moderation are pretty dim. Adam had said before we talked that he knew what I was going to say, so of course this made me want to come up with some reference that he won't have been expecting. All right. So there's a story from late antiquity in the Roman Empire that tends to surface in different contexts. I guess more recently, Gore Vidal used this vignette in his Emperor Julian about the Roman Empire who tried to restore classicism to the Christianized empire. And he sent one of his emissaries to Delphi to consult with the Pythoness, the lead oracle there, and asked her, should the emperor restore the temple of Apollo at Delphi? And the response from the oracle was, I'm probably paraphrasing here, tell the king, on earth has fallen the glorious dwelling, and the springs that once spoke are still. No shelter is left to the god, no roof, and in his hand the prophet laurel flowers no more. Things come to an end, epochs end, things pass away. And one of the articles that I have had cause to go back to over the last year most often was Adam's piece on the Zeitwende that appeared in Claire Berlinski's Substack, Cosmopolitan Globalists. And the fact is that Vladimir Putin did shock the Germans into recovering a sense of history, as you said. And I think this will have profound impacts on the world to come, particularly as the United States seems to fall away from the kind of responsibility that undergirded the American order that has prevailed since the aftermath of World War II. I don't know if we can actually get back the reasons that we actually supported that order, the things that made us able to do so. It wouldn't be the end of the world if the Germans took over some of that burden for us. But anyway, I got to tell you, I'm pretty pessimistic at the moment, but with the Brave Rangers people, I keep trying to fight the good fight and hang in there.
Well, we appreciate you fighting that fight with us, charitably and magnanimously. And I'm reminded in you bringing up the notion of the habits of moderation, and towards the end of Adam's opening remarks too, the notion that there's a fundamental educational and personal and mind-based thing that the old leftist slogan, the personal is the political, doesn't just mean things about social issues and who you vote for. It also does mean things about habits of citizenship and habits of engagement in public life that can perhaps be reflective of deeper things in the public mind, but also are each of our little relationships to the broader times that we live in. And maybe there are ways that even if that doesn't change the structural thing, perhaps the most punk rock thing is to be nice to your enemies in other ways, right? And so on that note, I was wondering if just for the next little part here, Jeff, I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into your thinking on the habits of moderation. You said that we can't do it now as much, or you don't believe that there's much prospect for those to be revived. But what hope do you see on it? And are there moments that perhaps people, to use you mentioned college students thinking about prior decades. Nowadays we would call that LARPing. The preferred decade is usually the 1310s, but there's other ones. And so to what degree do you see just around Washington now, around public discourse world now, any echoes whatsoever of the old, the Everett Dirksons of the world of once upon a time, Scoop Jacksons of once upon a time, those habits of moderation existing in American life nowadays? And Adam, same question to you about the binaryism of how people think about public life and the incredible lack of deep reading and all that. But are there, even in this age of spectacle, even in this age of tech saturation, do you see any reminders of the characters, I guess, at the end of Fahrenheit 451, going and in this desiccated media age where ChatGPT is going to write up all of our college papers for us, people cultivating the old arts of citizenship in any way resembling a meaningful thing that could keep the arts of deep literacy and true democracy that flows from it around. And I don't mind which of you goes first, but I'm just curious if either of you has any.
I mean, we're gathering on a day when Tucker Carlson got canned from Fox and Don Lemon got canned from CNN, so there's some grounds for optimism there, I would say. It's a difficult question because, Adam brought up this, what I think of in graphic form as a graph from the National Journal, where they plotted ideologically where the different members of Congress were and which members overlapped in Congress and the Senate. And back in the 1970s, more members overlapped than didn't. In other words, there were more conservative Democrats who aligned with Republicans on certain issues and liberal Republicans who aligned with Democrats on certain issues than there were people who just stuck strictly within the boundaries of their own political tribe. But since the mid-90s, there's been no overlap, zero. And if anything, those groups are getting further and further apart over time. I do think there's been asymmetric polarization in some ways, with the Republican Party going further, faster, sooner, but the Democrats are catching up in a lot of ways. And like I said, I think it is not, at this point, advantageous for your political career to actually be a moderate. Now, you can say, well, but look, there's the problem solvers caucus. There's people like that who actually, did have a big piece written about them in Politico when they got the infrastructure bill passed. Yeah, 19 Republican senators voting for a Democratic infrastructure bill is not nothing. On the other hand, Of the Republicans in the House who voted for that bill, 0 are currently holding political office. And Donald Trump, although he had claimed that he was going to bring Infrastructure Week, if not month, if not year, and have a $2 trillion bill, in the end demonized people on the Republican side who voted for that legislation, because this is the world we live in. It's not what you stand for in terms of policy. Policy doesn't matter at all. It's how visibly you can be seen to own the opposition in a way that gratifies the deepest and darkest instincts of your tribe. I don't really see that going away anytime soon, except I was reading Henry Kissinger's latest book on leadership, and he actually quotes toward the end something that I thought was just an alt-right meme, but apparently it's Machiavelli channeling Livy, which is the old saying that good times bring soft leaders bring bad times bring hard leaders bring good times.
It's also Ibn Khaldun in Machiavelli.
So all these different ways, and people who've seen this. And I think there is some truth to that, and that implies that there's a self-correcting capacity in the system for what I'm calling moderation. Moderation is an awfully hard quantity to define, but as I'm thinking it refers to taking a long view of things. I think James Q. Wilson defined it as the habits of self-restraint, of considering your impact of your actions on other people, as well as thinking about the long term. And I just don't see any of that in our political leadership right now.
Yeah, let me continue along the same lines. And, one of the things that has struck me in recent years as I thought about this, if you go back to 1776, 1789, 1791, the origins of the documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, I don't think the majority of the American people, the citizens, ever really read those things or really ever understood them. We had what Plato would call guardianship. We had a group of elites that were public spirited and that understood their responsibilities as elites to the body politic, to the civic culture. And one of the factors that enabled this was that there seemed to be, or it was possible to create a common mission or a common goal for the country. So in the beginning of the country, what were we trying to do? We were assimilating a lot of immigrants and we were spreading west. We had a continent to control, right? If you look, with a notable exception of the bloody Kansas and the Civil War, Americans could usually define a reason for being together in a political community. Whether it was progress, the Industrial Revolution, later on the social movements that, anti-slavery, women's rights, unionization. There was something that we were doing together. We had a mission. In the Cold War, of course, it was keeping the world safe from communism. It was putting a man on the moon, the space race. There was always something that political leaders could point to that not all Americans, of course, but most Americans saw as a national project or a national goal. Where is that now? Why are Americans still living in a single political community when we cannot define a consensual understanding of why we're in that? What are we doing? What's our purpose? There are lots of answers to the question, but there's no consensus. They're all over the map. And I think this is really the first time in American history where the lack of a common sense of why we're in a single political community together has been so vast. And that's why I think there was a poll, I think in October of last year, that was really very shocking, which you can't believe the numbers you always see in polls. Anybody who's taken the social science stat package to get a doctorate knows that, but still, this was a pretty impressive thing. Something like 80% of the people who were questioned believed that if the other guys got power, it was an existential threat to the existence of the United States as we have known it. Now, this again gets back to my point about the zero sum. The return, let me just say one other thing. I think it's important for people to understand that the Enlightenment, the classical liberalism, which is the font of all American political and most social institutions, was something new under the sun for its time. Why was it new? What was important about it? The founders and the philosophers before them, whom they read, whether it was Locke or Montesquieu, they discovered something. They discovered the positive sum. They discovered that you could engineer, you could build social institutions in such a way that you got positive sum outcomes. You could even take something like human greed right? And if you were Adam Smith, you could create the idea of the invisible hand. And there was a little picture at the heart of the Anglo-American thinking in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. What Aristotle in De Anima calls the little picture that allows thought, okay? And in the Anglo-American world, it was the dynamic equilibrium, which David Landis argued in a wonderful book called A Revolution in Time, came from the fascination that these people had with orreries and models of the universe and so on. And this followed also from scientific discoveries. In the old world, the Greek gods and the Roman gods were jumping around in the dome of heaven, acting like, tarts and fools and vindictive and so forth. And the new vision of the solar system was separate bodies in harmony with one another, balancing one another. And they took this metaphor, this little picture, this metaphor, and they said, what if we apply this to the architecture of political and social institutions? Can we escape what I would call political Malthusianism? Can we get to a better place? All right? And you see the division of separation of power. You see, again, the invisible e pluribus unum, all of these iconic notions that we have about the way we do things in the United States. All of this stems from this idea of a dynamic equilibrium which produce positive, or at least variable sum, positive sum outcomes when everybody plays by the rules of the Constitution and the procedure. Every American institution is based on this what was a revolutionary idea. And what was especially revolutionary about it was it meant that the Whig idea of history, the possibility of moving forward, of actually progressing materially and morally at the same time, was a real possibility. It was not the cyclical over and over and over again of the ancient world. You could actually get somewhere. You could dream about a better future, and you could comport your institutions in such a way to actually get there. And that was the optimism of that age, of the age of science and of the early classical liberalism that the founders put into action in our systems of government, all right? The zero sum that has returned is anathema to this basic idea. There would be some pushback against the return of the zero sum if we taught civics at all in schools anymore. But we don't teach civics. We spend $50 per student teaching STEM. We spend 5 cents per student teaching civics. So into the vacuum where students are not taught the essence of the Enlightenment, the essence of classical liberalism, how the government works, into that flows this revenant zero-sum old stuff. It's like pushing on an open door. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because of the media environment and just one more point. Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate from 1987, invented this term, the attention economy. Some of you may know that. He did it at a time when it was a mere thing. He simply argued that in order to do well economically, you first have, it's like advertising, you have to get the attention of the potential customer. And what that's burgeoned into with the technological tsunami, with the digital revolution, is something that Herbert Simon himself could never have imagined. But there is simply no reward for moderation and cooperation and tolerance. You get more attention by being outrageous, and that's what I refer to as the age of spectacle. But I mean spectacle in a very specific way, and here I'll stop. Some of you remember Ripley's Believe It or Not in the cartoon, the paper, right? Ripley's Believe It or Not. Right? What was that in the comics, right? It was the newspaper fun section equivalent of the old carnival two-headed cow. And what do I mean by that? Okay, you're in the carnival, right? You're at some state fair. It's 1906 or whatever, and you through the glass darkly, you seem to see a cow with 2 heads, and you say, well, what happens to you? Is that real or is that fake? And there's a moment of uncertainty where you're not sure, and that is very exciting. That uncertainty is very exciting. It really draws your attention. It draws what cognitive psychologists refer to as our novelty bias, because you don't see that every day, all right? Look at Jerry Springer show, right? Was that real? Was that scripted? American politics has become one never-ending episode of the Jerry Springer show, right? Why? Because it stimulates that astounding complex, that spectacle where you're not sure if it's real or not. This is entertainment in the 21st century. We are addicted to entertainment. And it used to be, to get entertainment, you had to go into some room, turn on the television set, maybe find the damn remote, right? Now, with the magical rectangles that we all carry around, you can go down the rabbit hole anywhere, anytime, 24/7. And people do, We are addicted to distraction. That's what Senator Sass, former Senator, still Senator Sass said. If the only Republican I miss from the Senate. We are addicted to distraction. We have a feedback loop that actually, we have dopamine flows that reward us for being distracted. In an environment, in a cognitive environment like that, what everybody is vying for is maximum feasible attention. Look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. The woman doesn't have a brain in her head, but she sure knows how to get attention. Look at Donald Trump. That's what he knows how to do. He knows how to get on the news and stay on the news. And that's what it takes nowadays. And that attention economy phenomenon does not reward moderation, does not reward cooperation, does not reward governance. I'll stop there.
Could I just add something, since you raised this idea of celestial mechanics?
Yeah.
You do see the founders repeatedly talking about the importance of balance and norms, and the idea that you can't get everything of what you want, to speak to that zero-sum idea. And I think that was deeply ingrained through the society. And the founders famously did not want parties, the mischief of factions. But they assumed that if there were parties, that they couldn't actually become monolithic parties because they would be representing people from the different states and localities who would have such divergent interests that they could never combine into one national party that would say only one ideological position. And then further, the idea that you would actually then have parties divided by race, as well as region, and by religion, that was just something they didn't think was possible. Now it is. And I think, again, this actually speaks to human motivations, not just the desire for attention, but the desire to be with one's tribe, and to feel safe in one's tribe. And the universities, which is an area I know well, this is actually where the critique extends to what the left has done. The universities always understood that they could not be captured by one political position. And in fact, that would be profoundly dangerous to their continued existence in American life. And so they always maintained the importance of the university as a free and open forum for contending ideas without fear or favor. And now universities are seen as a place that they are captured by the left, I can attest to that. There are no Republicans on those faculties for the most part. Even Republican ideas at this point are not something that is just bad, wrong, disagreeable. The ideas themselves are seen to cause harm. And so the whole principle of balance has been lost here. And you can say the same thing about the Republican Party that used to be a big tent. You can go through the list of institutions that have become corrupted by this form of tribalism and the desire to insulate its members from harm.
I fully concede all of this, and I essentially agree with the pluralist notion that the general nature of America is e pluribus unum. It's the creation of bigger things that don't actually make real rational sense from smaller things that might make a little bit more rational sense but aren't really compatible with each other. I completely agree with that. That being said, it seems to me that, I remember Publius has a line, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. There's a notion that civic virtue, inner moderation, the prudence of statecraft, while it might be good, we cannot rely upon it always being there. And if it is not always there, the question is, do we have institutions that by their institutional structure can harness people's immoderation and ambition and other things in ways that are fundamentally productive and fruitful for the public will? Now, I guess my basic question that I have here is that thanks to the mentorship and tutorship of both of you over the last decade or so, have like obsessively pored over history in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, and in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and in these times. And it seems to me that for the most part, there actually is a very radicalizing zero-sum, maybe not necessarily in the same ways that we see nowadays, but there are very radicalizing zero-sum movements in all those points. 1850s, certainly, but I mean, even if you look at the early 20th century, there is a very, very quasi-fascist and at the very least very rapidly right-wing anti-liberal version of republicanism. There are, in fact, a few communists in the US government working to sap and purify our precious bodily fluids. And there's a certain kind of crusading liberalism, much of which actually is in the New Deal as well in itself, that does want to stamp out a certain kind of thing. And then you have the reactions against these. You have the brown scare people, you have the red scare people, and you have every bit as cutthroat partisans in the interest of their party machines as you have nowadays cutthroat partisans in the interest of the finance media machines that the parties have regrettably become. And amid all those, the parties themselves, perhaps the constitutional system more broadly, perhaps only in the thanks to the maestro efforts of people like FDR and William F. Buckley, you do have those uncharitable zero-sum things being harnessed for broader public ends that we do have written in history books nowadays. Why is today different? Why can't we take the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world and the American university systems of the 2020s and put them, dare I say it, towards a higher public interest that even they don't really foresee themselves being a part of, but winds up being tamed and made productive in the American broader pluralist context without necessarily having to become inherently moderate? Is there a particular reason nowadays why we are unable to do that?
Let me try a different way of getting at the point. I don't see a way to do it right now. Not absent of full frontal collapse, and somebody younger people pick up the pieces. And there's some good news, by the way, about younger people. Even though sometimes when I talk to younger people and I say, "Our hopes repose in you," they shriek in horror. Are you kidding? We don't know what we're There are basically, I think, three reasons why we're in a different place right now. Okay, and I'm writing a book about this, so I have to be very careful to be brief. First is we have a massive unearned and unappreciated affluence. We are the most affluent society, notwithstanding the inequalities that exist, most of which, by the way, are misunderstood, sometimes willfully misunderstood. But we are so affluent. Affluence does not conduce to community. Affluence conduces to decadence. You don't have to just read Al-Muqaddimah, read Jacques Barzoon, from Dawn to Decadence, a wonderful book. We are soft. The quote before, we are soft and we don't care. We just rather be entertained. In the novel Timeline by the late Dr. Michael Crichton, there's a wonderful quote that I like to refer to. I don't have it with me, about every other age had a higher goal. They wanted to be saved, they wanted to be educated, they wanted to be refined, they wanted to be moral. We just want to be entertained all the time. And if we're not entertained, we'll switch affiliations, switch channels, we'll switch. We just want to be entertained. It's a little bit like Fahrenheit 451 argument that it isn't Brave New World where people are preventing people from reading books or anything like that. It's that we have so trivialized our culture that nobody cares to read a book. That's where we are. If you have to pick somebody who was more prophetic, I mean, I pick Huxley and then Fahrenheit 451, not Orwell. But the point is, when you get to that point, when things just aren't serious and people aren't reading, okay, they're really kind of like two ways to get across to people content, right? One is ideological language and one is analytical language. Scholars use analytical language. We taught the methods of rules of evidence and how to look at things as objectively as possible. But ideological language is a different thing. It is inherently simplifying. It is inherently more emotional. It is inherently sped up compared to the slow and deliberate nature of analytical thinking. Ideological language always conflates. Analytical language always looks for distinctions. All right? So, in a sense, the technology and the currents in the culture are essentially imbecilizing the society in many ways. The difference, but they were always, zero-sum types in America, but they were on the fringes. And there were always adults at the center, most of the time, not all the time. Adults at the center that took care of business. And then there's one other thing I want to mention as to why it's the same and it's different. Now, Steve Stefano's here somewhere. I don't know where he is. Okay.
Hi, Frank.
Frank, I'm sorry. Frank Stefano's here. Frank has done something in a book published, 5-6 years ago, I guess. Frank has done something that a whole lot of professional historians managed somehow to overlook. What he did was he interlaced the history of American religious revivals and American religious history with the standard political and economic histories. And he talked about, in some depth, the three great awakenings in American history. If you know your history, you know what we're talking about. More recently, the social gospel, the progressive 1920s. Before that, the Methodist Circuit Riders. Before that, the revival just before the Revolutionary War. And he interlaced and showed how the social energies from these religious revivals deeply affected American politics. And one of the ways they did that was they brutalized discourse, and they made it hard to compromise, because these were essentially religious movements. Now, the first Great Awakening and the second one were certainly, they were churched. They came out of the churches. The third one in the 1910s and 20s was somewhat less churched. A lot of people argue that we are now in the midst of a fourth Great Awakening, except it's mostly de-churched. And I would argue to you that, especially on the left, the so-called wokesters, but even on the right, what we're seeing here is a kind of children's crusade. This is essentially a religious movement. And I could walk you through the characteristics of it, but it has the syntax of a religious, not the content, but the syntax of a religious movement, the kinds of questions it asks, the kinds of certainties that it espouses, the level of intolerance, the illiberalism in it, the my way or the highway attitudes, again, the zero sum. These are essentially religious movements. So to get to the answer, these things always burn themselves out, because religious revolutions as well as political revolutions tend to eat their children, and then things return to a normalcy. There's usually a lot of breakage in the process, sometimes wars and other forms of mayhem. But if you look at it sociologically, as though what we're seeing on the extremes is a form of a fourth Great Awakening, right? Then there's hope that it will burn itself out one day, right? Hopefully it doesn't burn everything else with it. So and there's one final thing. If you're looking for good news, everybody's looking for something to be optimistic about. Well, there's at least one thing. We talked about it before. There are whole new cohorts of young people now who 40, 50 years ago would never have much of a chance to make a real positive difference to American culture and American society, right? Racial minorities, women, sexual minorities really would have been sort of like dealt out of the process. There are now untold scores of brilliant, talented, ambitious, public-spirited people, right, who are going to have a chance to make a mark in a way that just wasn't possible half a century ago. That's very good news. So sometimes crazy stuff burns itself out. A lot of times it burns itself out. We have new cadres coming along. That might be the answer to your question.
Frank, just so you know, my personal opinion is we're in the fourth industrial revolution, the fifth Great Awakening, and the seventh party realignment. But let's talk about that. So, Jeff, same question to you.
Just a quick point then. I mean, numbers aside, what's I think stands out from a longer historical perspective is that this era we're living through is unusual in American history in its alternation of party dominance. No one party has controlled the Congress for more than a few years at a time, and it just flips back with some regularity, and this is what leaves us in a position of stasis. We cannot deal with our major challenges because no party has a big enough margin in the Congress to actually get anything done. And I think this also has to do with the fact that parties used to know what was necessary to exercise large majorities. And it usually required keeping a very tight hold indeed over the more lunatic fringe of your party. And there were various ways that they exercised that, some of which no longer apply because the finances have changed. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a huge figure in the Republican Party, not just because she's an outrageous person, but she could raise so much money from the grassroots. And this phenomenon has been with us since 1964, when Goldwater set records for small dollar donations from the grassroots. But it also was the fact that Goldwater and his movement that had captured the Republican Party machinery, not through persuasion and argument, but just through backroom maneuvering, was hugely unpopular with the American people. It was so far out there. And this led to Republicans getting wiped out, not just in the presidential election, but at every level of governance, even down to state and county governments. And the Republican Party said, we cannot do this again. So the idea that Ronald Reagan is just Barry Goldwater reborn is completely wrong, because Ronald Reagan understood that there was a center in American politics, and you have to appeal to it, and you have to actually keep the fringes in line. And I think it's that sense that's been lost, particularly this idea that elections are all about mobilizing your base, and then giving nothing to your opponents. Because if this is a religion that's taken hold of politics, it's a religion without a sense of redemption. It's a religion without a sense of our shared humanity.
I want to do 1.5 more questions to you two before we open up to audience Q&A. So folks in the audience, if you have questions that you would like to phrase in the form of a question, please start thinking about those now, and we'll go through some of the last stuff here. So this is kind of a three-parter question to both of you, and I think it addresses the institutional things on internal dynamics of how Americans treat each other, and how partisans treat each other inside their own institutions, and then treat their fellow counter-partisans on the other side. But it also goes to some of the deeper aspects of that too. And it's, I guess it takes the form of three arguments. One argument, and both of you cited this to some degree earlier, is that when there is a common enemy to the American national project, or to perhaps any group, it is far easier to maintain and establish group coherence among all members of that group. I wonder to what degree you think that applies both as something for American politics more generally, is the absence of a Soviet-like or Nazi-like common enemy to America these days, something that results in what we're in right now and have been in since the 90s, or is it more complex than that? I'm fascinated in both of your thoughts on that. Second off, to what degree is the perception of greater American cultural and racial diversity since the 70s in mass public life, to what degree is that something that has influenced our current divisions or not? And I actually, I tend to strongly disagree with the notion that it is, but I'm curious what you two's notions are on that, because I think that's one of the biggest things in our day to get the discourse right on. And then lastly, aside from that, what is the role that that public education questions played in this once upon a time, versus to what degree do they play a different role in that now? We certainly know that there's been a ballooning of people with higher education in the last 50 years that there wasn't before the 60s and 70s. Some folks have made the argument of elite overproduction, I believe, and that has been a common argument. And so I'm curious what you all think about it. So take those however you like. Absence of common enemy, increased racial and cultural diversity, increased standards of higher education. To what degree do those influence the way you think about all these things here? And to what degree do those help us understand polarization now versus in the 20th century?
Whoa. I would like to just make a very brief comment about the first question, and then spend a little bit more time on the second one and ignore the third one altogether, because I don't know what to say about it. Jeff will know more about that than I could he's forgotten more about that than I've ever known. What was the first one again?
To what degree is the absence of a common enemy?
Oh yeah. Like I said before, the context really does matter. And we fought. There's central government. The power of the federal government in this country has always been relatively weak. We have a large state, but we have a weak state, right? And that's more or less by design. It has to do with both culture and then a lot of things people have written lots of books about. But Americans don't like to be governed from the center that's far away from where they live. Not every culture in the world is like that. My wife and I spent a year in Singapore a couple of years ago. 2/3 of the people, three-quarters of the people live in Singapore, ethnic Chinese, Nanyang Chinese, South Sea Chinese. They like to be governed. They don't act like Americans. There are no chowderheads in Singapore. They like to be governed. They had experienced SARS before COVID, and they like to be governed. They understand the purpose of it. It's not like America's kind of an outlier in terms of the distrust of central authority. This has been magnified in the culture ever since the movie 3 Days of the Condor. He took the deep state idea to the bank, right? And that, by the way, there were a lot of crazy ideas, or sort of not crazy, it's the wrong word. A lot of sort of edgy ideas that started on the left that now ended up on the right, including, by the way, postmodernism. But we don't have time to go into that. But
another America's public forum.
Yeah, and I don't have time to go into it. It's really fascinating. But these ideas, they tend to migrate from one illiberal extreme to another illiberal extreme. The other difference is that the liberal center is getting squeezed out by all these influences that Jeff and I have mentioned. That's another difference. But I want to talk a little bit about race. All right, how do I do this? I grew up in segregation. That's how old I am, all right? I remember the 2 drinking fountains and the 3 bathrooms at the People's Drugstore down the street from my house in Northern Virginia, within a rock throw of where we are sitting, okay? And if you can't imagine if you can't visualize what I'm talking about, if you can't visualize what it means to be 2 drinking fountains and 3 bathrooms, you really ought to count yourself very fortunate, because it was ugly, really ugly, all right? Since that time, and we don't have to go through the history of Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, since that time, there have been huge attitudinal changes in the United States. There have been huge changes in the political economy. But we are, I think, we are beset by Tocqueville's paradox when it comes to this particular subject. I hope some of you at least are familiar with Tocqueville's paradox of democracy in America. But, just to paraphrase, it goes like this. He said it in French. I'm not going to say it in French because I can't. But he said, when inequality and bad treatment is the common order of society, then small indignities are ignored. But the more the society approaches equal treatment, the more intolerable any exception from that equal treatment becomes. In other words, the better things get, the worse they seem in a lot of cases, right? So you have people who are, didn't experience what I did either directly or indirectly, who actually can make the argument to you that racial relations in the United States are just as bad today as they were 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's just not true. I worked for 2 black people in the Department of State, and I guarantee you, they didn't have any problem with the color of their skin, neither did anybody else. In American history, class and culture and racial appearance all get tangled together. And the people who insist that it's all about skin color, and it's not about culture, and it's not about class, are speaking ideologically rather than analytically. They do not know what they're talking about. They are conflating everything together. But we have a problem with Tocqueville's paradox right now when it comes to race relations. And unfortunately, because of the influence of, I don't know what I would call them, I'm going to say generically the left, we are using language now that is profoundly unhelpful to reversing and understanding better that we are in fact ensnared in Tocqueville's paradox. What do I mean by that? If you open up the Washington Post today, or the New York Times, whether this is because of the 1619 Project or whatever it's from, and this has only been in the past couple of years. And by the way, I've been through lots of different names for African Americans. When I was a kid, African Americans were Negroes. Then they were African Americans. Then they were Afro Americans. But now black seems to be the choice. But it's capitalized. And white is now capitalized. I'm talking about the tribes, right? I cannot, when you, in common language, when you say black and white, what are you talking about? You're talking about opposites, right? So black and white have now begun to mean to people who don't know any better, not colors, but cultures. That there is a black universal culture and there is a white universal culture. And you have got to be an American, by which I mean very insular, to think that any such thing could possibly be true. It's nonsense, right? But the use of these terms with capital letters, no less, reifies this idea that black people and white people are opposites in some fundamental cultural way. And that's just not true. I'm sorry Stanley Crouch is no longer among us, but he and others have made the point that if you look back into the American history, to the very beginning of it, right, the entangling of these cultures and subcultures is so profound that one is hard to imagine without the other. It doesn't mean that they're equal, right? Not at all. We all know the history. But why make it worse? Now, Pearl Bailey. Anybody remember Pearl Bailey? Anybody as old? Pearl Bailey was a singer back in the late 40s and 1950s. She made a hit with a song called Road, Road, Road. Probably don't know what I'm talking about. But there was a black woman, Negro woman at the time she just hated this idea of calling people black and white. And she would say, look at your skin, look at my skin. Is that white? No. No? These are reifications that bear no resemblance to reality. Why don't we just treat ourselves like human beings? Why don't we do it? Later on, Martin Luther King said, consider the content of our character not the color of our skin. Right now, the media culture and sort of like the salon culture is pointing our language itself in precisely the wrong direction as far as I'm concerned. It's extremely harmful. Imagine young people coming up, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds. They are inured to this. They don't know any other way to describe it. Why shouldn't they think that black and white are opposites rather than cultural complements, which is what we are in American history? This really bothers me, but I don't know what to do about it. If you have any ideas, you let me know.
As a card-carrying member of the vast mixed-race conspiracy, I am doing my part to help out that.
Good for you.
Also, everybody who's interested in the backdrop of black-white relations all the way to the founding as like a cultural thing, David Hackett Fisher just finally published that book he's been saying he was going to publish for 30 years and not doing, and he finally finished it, African Founders, and that is a really, really, really good in-depth investigation.
I hope he had an editor this time, because Albion Seed is 5 times longer than it needs to be.
He didn't, so yeah, it's just as good.
So I don't like these multiple independent reentry vehicle kinds of questions. Let me just put in a plug here for my podcast, the Bible Center podcast. I had Nikki Hemmer come on a few months ago. She's written a book recently called Partisans, which is about the 1990s and how almost immediately as soon as the Cold War ended, a lot of what had held the Republican Party together came apart. And that's when you actually had first Ross Perot and then Pat Buchanan as sort of the critical actors of that era and the forebears of Trumpism. I think it's also worth considering in the Cold War the paradoxes as they relate to race. So one of the great allies of the civil rights movement was precisely the Cold War conflict, because this meant that white moderates, who normally would just prefer to concentrate on the status quo and not pay attention to the civil rights movement, had to pay attention because it made us look bad when the Soviet Union and its allies would raise the mistreatment of blacks at the UN and other forums and show that American democracy was a hollow pretension. And that forced America to live up to its own ideas. I guess in terms of paradoxes, if you went back to the earlier part of the 20th century and looked at which of the public high schools in DC tended to have the highest test scores, to the extent that there were such things, it was usually Dunbar High School, which was an all-black high school. They had something to prove. They proved it. This does not, of course, mean that segregation should come back, but it does mean that in any era, at any time, there are going to be paradoxes that you need to be alive to. And it's precisely this kind of paradox which, and complexity of history that we do not have in education right now, at any level, I think. And substituting civic patriotism for identity has been a really bad bargain for the left. It has allowed bad actors like Ron DeSantis to use wedge issues against them to great effect, although he has no idea where to stop. But it's just a bad situation, and I think the left really ought to have it.
On the note of paradoxes, the single biggest reason I'm skeptical of the notion that a common enemy is useful for national unity is that I'm just reminded that at all the moments in American history where there was a very clear common enemy, the Second World War and the First World War most specifically, but also over the course of the Cold War, we committed the most egregious violations of civil liberties against ourselves and against particular subgroups of the American population at those points. And as Walter McDougall and other civil religion historians note, the civil religious kind of messianic fervor got to a zero-sum degree, particularly during the First World War, and then in some ways during the propaganda of the Second World War, and then certainly during the Red Scares, that dwarfs anything we ever do to ourselves in peacetime, at the level of like, they are not an American because they are anti-war or because of some other thing.
I'm just going to really quickly say I think that's much truer of the First World War than it is the Second World War, because we actually learned from our experiences. And frankly, we also learned from the causes of the First World War. The Germans' decision to take Alsace and Lorraine gave rise to a revanchism on the part of the French that made that war all but inevitable. We actually, I think, learned something from our experiences. And I think that shows up domestically in the trajectory of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s as well.
I think it's also worth, if you're speaking in particular about the internment camps of the Japanese.
That too, yeah.
Point, yeah. Well, the country was vastly more racist in the 1940s and the 1930s and before that, and also vastly more anti-Semitic than than it has become now. So, you know, you could see a trajectory of gradual and I think sustained toleration and progress in the best sense of the word. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. The road is never smooth, it's always bumpy. There's always regression. In a time of panic and fear, people often, you know, find not their better angels, which was the original, by the way, name of this organization, but their worst angels. They find their worst ones. And in a society like this, this is a sidebar, but this is not a country, this is not a political system we have where government attempts to smother social energies. Right? It gives them vent, and more often than not in American history, again, Frank knows more about this than me, positive change in American society, as we reckon it today, starts in the society and the government follows along behind it. All the major movements, for better or for worse, abolition, women's rights, women's suffrage, so it starts as social movements akin to the Great Awakenings in the society, and the government is dragged along behind it. Now, we know this is what we experience, this is our history. You may think this is sort of common, but if you look around the different political cultures of the world, it's not common at all. It's not common at all. Just here's an example that maybe you never thought of. Let's say you're in Italy, or you're in Israel, or you're in Germany, or you're in the Netherlands, and there's a public park or something, or there's an area, you know, that's just filthy, or you want to build something, you want to build a new playground or something like that, right? It would never occur to people in these countries to do it themselves. They would always go to the government and expect the government to do these things. Americans, because of the nature of our expansion into essentially a lawless or administrative vacuum in the frontier, Americans have had in the past the habit of do it yourself, get together, the community, right, and society advance before the government. That's our nature, okay? In the United States, people actually give money to the government. They have bequests, they give antiques, they give beautiful things to the government because the government is trusted as a repository of a national heritage. Have you ever heard of a European wealthy person giving a gift to their government? I never heard of such a thing. We are different. We are real outliers in that regard. And it's just a point of social history, I think, that it's also actually a point of hope. At some point, you know, this do-it-yourself, you know, gather the forces, just get it done, throw the lawyers out of the room, you know, use common sense, get it done. I mean, I think there's hope still because that sits in our DNA as a country, as a nation. I hope that's still true.
On the note of names of civic movements, When Braver Angels inevitably establishes a special operations paramilitary arm. We're still waffling over naming it the Darker Angels or the Killer Angels for Jeff Sharp's great album. So we'll let you know that.
Yeah, okay.
We're about to go to questions for the audience, but I have one last question for Jeff and Adam on the notion on this happy note that they've had here. So that is, who do you think, like which character in American history, which figure in American political, intellectual, or social history should young people in America dig up, read all the writings of, pore over them, trying to figure out how to live their life in modern circumstances? Which figures from the broader American political tradition could young folks on these various movements, on the ascent, with opportunities we've never had before, which folks should we all be, to use a current term, LARPing as?
You know,
if nothing comes to mind, I'll ask that.
I can tell you where I was last weekend. I went down to the grave of Zora Neale Hurston. She was a great African-American woman writer known for Their Eyes Are Watching God, which I think is one of the great novels of the 20th century. Was part of the Harlem Renaissance. Died broke and was buried in an unmarked grave in Fort Pierce, Florida, which is just up the road from where I live in Florida as well. But if students go to her, and they probably will because her work will be assigned to them, they will find a writer who just defies categorization and has an unbelievable heterodoxy and originality to her ideas on everything. And I think that would be a good encounter with a mind that they might not otherwise find.
I totally second that suggestion. She was a very, very controversial figure in her day, but she had a mind of her own, and she just wouldn't shut up. She was a very strong courageous person. I have a very obscure suggestion. It's self-serving because I wrote an essay about this person. And I want y'all to go read it. John Lewis Waller. John Lewis Waller. You've never heard of John Lewis Waller, I'm sure. No relation to Fats, by the way.
I read your essay, though.
You read my essay, so you know about it. But this is one of the I think one of the essays that I've written in recent years that I'm most proud of. I don't want to tell you the whole story because it's too much. But this guy, John Lewis Waller, was born in Missouri in 1857, a slave. He was liberated with his family by the Union Army. He ended up going to school, white family in Kansas, taught him how to read. Went to college, had to drop out because of sickness in his family. But he got into politics. He was very articulate. He was very bright. He went into newspaper business. And back in those days, if you were in the Midwest, you were a Republican, right? That was the party of Lincoln. And he worked his way up. He tried to triage the black and the white politicians of that period of Reconstruction, and then afterwards into the late 1870s, early 1880s. And to make a long, fascinating story short, he also ran a barbershop, had a part ownership in a saloon, even though he was against alcohol. Got to make money somehow, right? You have kids, you have a family. He ended up being appointed by President Harrison as American consul to the Kingdom of Imerina. Right? Imerina. He became like essentially an ambassador to Imerina. You never heard of it, have you? Don't know where it is, do you? That was the name of what we call today the Malagasy Republic, Madagascar. There was a kingdom, the Merina Kingdom on the island of Madagascar that went back 600 years. These were Austronesian people who came from Borneo. They were not Bantu-speaking people who came from Africa, who dominated the island for many years, and Waller was sent to be the American consul. And he was sent with instructions by the Secretary of State and so on and so forth. What ended up happening was he developed a very, very close friendship with Queen Ravalona III. All the queens of Verena were women, right? And he ended up marrying off his daughter, Jenny, to one of the queen's nephews, Henri. Right? And from that union was born a man who shortened his last name because Madagascar names are impossible to spell or pronounce. He shortened his name to Andy Razaf. Now, I mentioned Fats Waller before, right? Those of you who know the history of American jazz will recognize the name of Andy Razaf because he was the lyricist for not all, but most of Fats Waller's greatest hits. Ain't Misbehavin', Citadel, all of them, right? And he was related to the Queen of Marina. The French came in 1885 or 1886. It's called the second. It was a war. Basically, the French just came in and took over the island, killed Henri, killed a lot of people, and they arrested John Lewis Waller for conniving with the locals to oppose the French rebellion. They tied him to the mast of his ship without any clothes on, basically, and sailed him to France, where they threw him in jail for treason. This caused célèbre between the United States and France in those years. It almost started a war. They ended up getting him out of jail, right, from the French, but in return for essentially ceding French control over Madagascar and the end of the Marina Kingdom. The Queen was exiled first to Réunion and then to Algiers. This is an unbelievable story, and nobody's ever heard of it, right? This was a very, very brave, very ingenious man that is a model for anyone to look up to, right? Of any skin color, of any kind. He was an amazing man, and his story really should be better known.
There's a kind of swashbuckliness to it.
Oh, yeah.
It's nice, yeah. Adam, I've always found that I learn a lot in your short versions of any story. So, yeah. All right, let's go to questions from the audience. First, Tommy in the back, please stand and ask your question as a question.
Sure. So the kind of second round of questions, the bemoaning of polarization in politics, all of the examples were essentially complaining that Republicans were not more like Democrats. So 19 Republicans voted for the infrastructure bill, but no House Republicans did. But like, how many pro-life Democrats are left in the Democratic Party? 48 House Republicans voted for gay marriage. How many Democrats voted against? So I was just wondering, it seems like often in these kinds of conversations, what ends up always happening is basically center-left or center-right people complaining that Republicans are not more liberal. Why is my characterization unfair? Or could the gentleman maybe give kind of another read?
Thanks. Thanks lots.
Yeah.
You can take it however you like.
Want me to go? That's an argument that has long legs in American history. I think it was Barry Goldwater who famously called the moderates in his party Tweedledum to the Democrats Tweedledee and accused Eisenhower of running a dime store New Deal. But what this critique omits is that what people like me are asking Republicans to do is not to adhere to Democratic positions, but to govern. That's not too much to ask. In fact, it's the bare minimum that we want to ask of people who purport to represent us. They have to put forward a vision of how they will approach the problems that they acknowledge exist in American life. And infrastructure is one of those things where it's like, it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, if your damn road has huge gaping potholes in it you can't drive on. And Republicans essentially have to come up with an argument, which they have had the luxury of not doing by virtue of the culture war. They have to say how they would responsibly govern if they were to be given the kind of power that they seek. And so far it seems to me that the desire to govern is just eroding within the Republican Party. The capacity to govern is not even thought of. And to the extent that Donald Trump has an idea for how to approach governance in his second term, it is Schedule F, to eviscerate the bureaucracy that actually makes possible governance. That is inadequate as a vision for a political party that seeks to be in control of the American society, economy, and much of the direction of the global world.
And I would only add to that, when you have an ex-president who claims that it would be a good idea to suspend the Constitution so that he could be put back in office, you're not talking Tweedledum, Tweedledee, right? You're talking about a Democratic Party that is, in my opinion, arguably pretty brain dead, and doesn't show much evidence of having a younger cohort that knows how to do anything politically. But the difference between a kind of a feeble and intellectually demobilized party like the Democrats on the one hand, and the Republicans who just want to burn down the federal government on the other, I mean that's a huge difference. Now, I consider the Republicans to be right now. I consider the left, the woke left, to be very dangerous to the culture long run, and they may turn out to be more dangerous to the country as a whole than the Republicans. But right now, it seems to me that the Republicans are in clear and present danger because they're simply their behavior spites the Constitution. It is illegal. What and there used to be a time when there was some shame about lying about things, but there's no shame at all in the MAGA world about lying, because again, it's postmodernism applied to the right. There is no truth. There are no facts. It's just a hegemonic narrative. It's whatever we can get people to believe. And if we say the same damn lie over and over again, a lot of people will believe it, and that's the strategy. And governance doesn't enter into it at all. And you have a party now that's fallen under the spell of what amounts to a political shaman. In the year 2020 election, the Republicans didn't even bother to put forth a platform. I can't think of any better evidence for the fact that they don't care about governance than the fact that they didn't even present a platform. So I have problems with both the parties. I have been an independent since 1991. I've never been a Republican. I used to be a Democrat. But to me, it's not a moral equivalence or a functional equivalence now between the two parties. One party is within the rules and within the Constitution, and the other has at least half a body outside of it. And I think that is a clear and present danger to the Republic.
Hey, so Tommy, and also all my fellow conservatives in here, I just want to let you all know that we will in fact be bringing more right-wing people onto America's public forums in the future as well too. We are in fact a ship that does all sails. So.
Can I ask a brief follow-up, because I don't think my question was very clear.
Sure. Yeah.
My
Just
point
a quick follow-up.
It was like, starting from Indiana, Joe Donnelly was a pro-life Democrat. He got elected in 2012, lost in 2018. Like, Donald Trump is attacking Ron DeSantis from the left on entitlements. It seems like if we care about depolarization, there should be a space for conservative Democrats. And it seems like there's a lot more space for quote-unquote liberal Republicans on policy, even if we take issue with everything. You can not want to cut Social Security and be a Republican just fine. You can be pro-infrastructure and be a Republican just fine. It doesn't seem like you can be a pro-life Democrat in the Democratic Party. It doesn't seem like you can be, anti-gay marriage and a Democrat in the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, like, these are like, so if we can just, which may be hard, we can kind of bracket but on like a policy level, it actually seems much easier to be a liberal Republican than a conservative Democrat.
This is a really interesting point. And
I used to be a Democrat. I voted for Joe Donnelly. That's what I'm trying to get at.
I mean, I think to some extent this does speak to the weaknesses of both parties, that they do not exercise the breadth of appeal that they once did. You do not find Bob Casey's in the Democratic Party at this point, because they have been purged. It's true. And without that, it is entirely possible that Democrats can no longer recover the kind of popular margins they had when they extended across a wider ideological terrain, put it that way. Having said that, the way that abortion in particular is being used as a political issue right now is entirely to the Democrats' benefit. I don't expect to see any movement on that. I'm more interested to see if there will be Republican acknowledgement that there can be pro-choice Republicans. Something like a third of Trump voters declare themselves to be pro-choice.
Yeah.
But I suppose that does speak to the dynamic that you are describing.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point now that it's clarified. I think that's right. And that's one of the reasons I'm not a Democrat, because there's no real diversity inside the party anymore. I used to work for Scoop Jackson, right? Now, Scoop Jackson couldn't get into the Democratic Party today any more than Richard Nixon could get into the Republican Party, right? It's impossible. That's just a description of how the two sides have drifted apart. When I worked for Scoop, briefly, when there were issues that brought Republicans and Democrats together on the same committee, same kind of issues, we were happy to work together. So Senator Jackson's staff and Senator Tower's staff from Texas, Republican, were happy to work together on a lot of arms control related issues and other issues that had to do with national security. That's where I met Bud McFarland. We didn't care if we were Republicans or Democrats. We cared about the issues because governance mattered. And that's the difference, right? That's one of the differences. If there were actual work to be done on governance, then I think a lot of the space that doesn't exist, that you point out, I think that space would be recreated if people focused again on stuff that needs to be done instead of the attention economy and all this all this spectacle stuff. Congress has got to find a way to actually understand what its job is again.
I saw a question from Sean. Sean.
Yeah, thank you both. This is really great. I want to ask about a couple issues where it seems to me
Also
there might.
stand up, Sean.
Okay, sorry. A couple issues where it seems like there might be some depolarizing tendencies, or at least some consensus. One is China, where it seems to me both parties are equally hawkish, whether that's good or bad. I'm curious your thoughts on that. Trade issues, where it seems like Bernie Sanders and Trump both spoke to something in both parties, and that's become almost a consensus point of view. And then third is more obscure, but like monopoly antitrust policies, where you see Josh Hawley and Elizabeth Warren working together. Are these exceptions to the polarization trend, or is there something else going on here? Thanks.
I think it was David Ignatius who had a column about how there is a consensus in Washington these days. It's kind of a negative consensus. It's Trump's view of trade and China the Democrats have tacitly accepted without necessarily defending. And it's a far cry from Ronald Reagan, I'll tell you that. But there is that. More generally, if I want to actually play the optimist here for a moment, I don't know to what extent Braver Angels has any relations with More in Common.
We do stuff every once in a while.
But they came out with a report in December that I still find, I think, important about the teaching of American history. And they surveyed Americans, do you think that we should actually revere George Washington and the founders? Do you think that we should teach American history, warts and all? And there actually was overwhelming agreement from Americans that we should take this kind of even-handed approach. But then what they did was very clever, I thought. They asked Democrats, how do you think Republicans would feel about the teaching of American history with all of its drawbacks? And Democrats, overwhelmingly said Republicans won't go for that. And yet they do. They asked Republicans, how do I think Democrats feel about symbols of national unity and the importance of the Declaration, the Constitution? Republicans to a person said Democrats hate those things. And the reality is the Democrats support them almost on the same margins as Republicans do. So I think there is a consensus in American life on a lot of good things, perhaps as well as bad things. The question is whether we can actually adjust our institutions to reflect that as opposed to ignore it.
Yeah, there's a lot of polling that's been done over the years. That there's an argument about this among political scientists, but a lot of polling that's been done showing that American citizens, as a group, are far more moderate, centrist, and pragmatic than the parties themselves. And part of that we've already talked about, that the primary process tends to push the parties toward their relative extremes. And that's one of the reasons why, over the years, hopes for third parties, not third parties as spoilers, but real third parties, who could do what William Jennings Bryan tried to do, invade the Democrats and take over the party in 1896. I mean, same name but different party. And we've seen this, on a couple of occasions. Mr. Stefano knows more about this than me, but it just seems to me that right now a third party bid is the idea of a viable third party is kind of like only talked about in terms of spoiler, right? And third parties can't raise any money. The last thing you want to do is end up re-electing the wrong guy. And I won't say who it is, but I think whichever party moves back to the center in a credible way with real programs is going to romp, especially if the other's not competing for the center. The center is where it is in this country. Nobody's representing it right now. And again, part of this, I go back to the spectacle thing. I mean, that is so pragmatic and so compromise necessary to do that. That's log rolling. That's making deals. That's fixing temporarily what you're not yet able to fix in a more permanent fashion. That's politics as a vocation, right? And that's boring and that's complicated. And nobody wants to hear about that, so that's not entertaining. So again, the whole culture meme seems to me to be rubbing the wrong way against that kind of development.
Sean, dipole work will be dipole work regardless of what the political circumstances are. But I personally, and this isn't an official organization position, this is just me playing fantasy football. I personally think the easiest world for policy consensuses is if you have a whole bunch of horseshoes between right-wing and left-wing internationalists, right-wing and left-wing nationalists, right-wing and left-wing big government people, right-wing and left-wing anti-government people, and have those all it doesn't even take a party realignment. It just takes a whole bunch more creative versions of bipartisanship where people have multiple connections they can work with on different things. And if you have that, and I think there are reasons to believe that particularly on things like industrial policy in China and even weirdly enough labor policy and tech policy nowadays, those sorts of horseshoes are starting to emerge. I think you see the beginnings of a different era in policy, and I don't think that is depolarization necessarily, but I do think that makes depolarization work easier as more policy gets done in that front. Question from the front here? Yes.
Okay.
Please stand.
I'll attempt a question here. It's half formed. That's got everybody on that. I was sort of thinking throughout all of this, I'm much more of an econ data person by trade and training, that I wonder about the role of state capacity to govern. Because we talked a lot about economics inequality and other things, but I wonder how, also parts of the culture have sort of made it this way, but also lowering taxes for the past 50 years is that, why believe in a government if you can't even fix the roads, if the money isn't there, if for some reason we can immediately provide aid to Ukraine, which I totally support, I'm half Ukrainian and all that, but that was a decision that the government at large made very quickly, but we still have holes in highways. We can't build a train network that we got rid of or whatever. And most, a lot of the industrial policy, quote unquote, is mostly just throwing money at things without actually attacking the equities that would have to change. So I wonder about, just the pure structures of power, like the state's both mostly fiscal and authority-wise ability to do anything. So even if somebody's there, to what extent could they actually change too many things, except in foreign policy, for example?
Among the hats I wear at the Niskanen Center as vice president, I'm in charge of something called the State Capacity Project.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something I worry about a lot. And actually, we might have talked about this, Luke. There was an interesting op-ed by Julius Crime in Philanthropy Daily.
I know that guy.
A few weeks ago. And Julius Crime is identified with, not just the right, but the MAGA right. But one of the points he was making in that piece was that, you have this movement of supply-side progressivism, which is people on the left very concerned about all the obstacles that liberalism has put in the way of an effective state, a state that can build, a state that can accomplish the goals that liberals say they want. Housing for the homeless, effective schools, effective institutions. All of these are hamstrung by various other liberal priorities, such as environmental policy, which makes it all but impossible to build, union regulations, and the like. Anyway, Krein was saying this is conservative territory. Conservatives ought to be contributing to this dialogue, and we're not. And I think that is an issue. And I think that you have a certain extent of like libertarian state casting, with the likes of Tyler Cowen. But at this point, the people we're hearing the critique from, and it's I think most powerful form, are people like Ezra Klein, Misha Chellam out at the Modern Power Substack in California, Roy Teixeira, who is admittedly a somewhat heterodox guy now at AEI, but he was making his way back at the Center for American Progress. So again, if you want to look for like some part of American life where there's optimism that there might be some common ground, it would be to come together on this issue of state capacity. But the problem is, I look at things like the IRS, one of the most underfunded agencies out there, and a move was put through by Democrats to restore some degree of the funding that they would have had if they'd been funded at the levels it was under Ronald Reagan. And instead this turns into a Republican culture war point. 287,000 IRS agents coming to audit you, Mr. Mom and Pop Small Business, which is ridiculous. It's a lie, frankly, on multiple levels, but that's what the, something that once upon a time would have been seen as an obvious era of common ground turns into. So, to be determined how this plays out.
You've just raised essentially political economy issues more broadly, and we haven't talked about this at all. In the list that I made about what has contributed to the rise of the zero-sum mentality that is displacing the positive-sum mentality that is the basis of all other institutions, one of them is the economy has become a lot more bestial to a lot of Americans, not just because of misinterpretation of the statistics that lead people to make claims about inequality that are not true. There is inequality and it has increased, but it's at the very, very top end. The top 1% skew the entire data set for the most part. But below that, we have a couple of major trends in the political economy. One is that we have so many distorted markets that we don't know what to regulate and what to deregulate. Look at big pharma. Look at agriculture. I mean, major aspects of the economy are festooned with government regulations. And there are two regulations can either fix a distorted market, or regulations taken away can free a market. So it's a complicated way that you use government regulations. But there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason in the way we do this. It's more politics than it is actually any rational application of regulation to these. So we have a huge number of distorted markets, and one of the functions of that is something called cost disease. Cost disease, you have rapid rise in the cost of basic services. Healthcare is certainly one, higher education is another, transportation is another, fuels are another, and no classical market explanation for these price rises make any sense. You have to look into back in the days of the railroad barons, you had plutocrats, fat cats, and you knew who they were. They had personalities, and they strutted around like like magnificent. Now we have gray-suited institutions, like a lot of healthcare companies. You can't identify who the hell these people are, but they have tremendous bargaining power within these distorted markets, and they create cost disease in key sections of the American economy. So it's plutocratized and distorted market system that we have. And because of the vested interests that are encrusted around all these things, and just because it's so damn complicated, I mean, it would take Zeus himself to disambiguate these things. Newt Gingrich, somebody that I know pretty well but don't particularly care for anymore, used to say, you look at the federal record, and every year you get these regulations, and it's talking about a hernia. The thing is, you couldn't even pick it up. He said, you can't reform this thing. You've got to drive the stake through its heart, start over again. There's a certain appeal to that because things are so mucked up that it's very hard to imagine incremental improvements on these distorted markets and the sources of cost disease that will ever get this under control again. Now, I'm not an economist, right? And I don't want to be an economist. And in fact, I don't even like a lot of macroeconomists. The people who told us 25 years ago, oh, you can export all these manufacturing jobs to Asia and Latin America and Mexico. It doesn't make any difference to the quality of a society whether you have a manufacturing economy or a service economy and all other such lies that they told, either because they're stupid or because they were bought. But I mean, of all the sins that have created, I mean, lawyers are first in my book, but macroeconomists come really close. But the way this all looks to me, all right, I don't see how you, in an age of gigantism, gigantic corporations, gigantic, just agglomeration, the net effect of the cyber revolution in a lot of ways, first past the post, internationalization of all these economic, I don't know how you get back to a light regulatory regime that respects both social equity and the markets. That's the $64,000 isn't anything anymore, but when I was a kid, that was a TV show, that was a lot of money. I don't know how you do that, but I know the question, I don't know the answer, I just know the question.
Adam, when Braver Angels eventually rolls out our much-vaunted depolarization skills for editors, lawyers, and macroeconomists, we would love to invite you to.
Yeah, I'll bring my guns.
Just kidding. Let's take a couple last questions. Corey, one from Corey.
Yeah.
Stand up, please, Corey.
So I want to act like it seems as if the country, in a lot of ways, in terms of the narrative of how we want to tell our story, seems in a lot of ways seems to be coming apart at the seams, like on both ends. Obviously on the left you have like 1619 Project and these like very aggressive identitarian ways of how we tell our history, but then on the right it seems that you see kind of like an extreme response to that in terms of, like, for example, in places like Florida where they are going the extreme route of trying essentially purging like black authors and trying to essentially censor large swaths of black history, and that's kind of, you know, where you kind of call it critical race theory or whatever. Do you think, I want to ask, like, do you think that there's any like actual solution to this, or is like, does it seem like we're just kind of like on this like irreversible path of like, it seems like we're going to have like one national narrative if you live in a place like, you know, Texas or Louisiana or Alabama, and then you're going to have like the exact opposite, very aggressive left narrative if you live in New York or California. And like, what does that mean for the country, where people just view what America is in just like these incredibly, extremely different ways?
I mean, I think that's a good question, but I think that's the system we already have.
Yeah.
Because the textbook market, particularly for high schools, is largely set by the states, and these do break down along partisan lines. So you're not actually getting one narrative. I mean, I had touched on the More in Common study, which suggests that there is more agreement on some of these issues than you think. And again, one of the worst parts about being a moderate in America right now is not just that you're politically unrepresented, but these culture wars pose these terrible false dichotomies. That you either have the 1619 Project, which has this hugely contentious idea of what America is all about, and in opposition you get the 1776 Commission, which is largely a whitewashing of American history.
Literally.
It is, yeah. And so, you know, I think maybe the solution would be more local debates. I mean, I'm from Brevard County, where Moms for Liberty was started, not one of our prouder legacies, I think. And you know, what that has shown is that at this point, the system is responsive to just a few loud, angry, extreme voices. But if you can actually mobilize the broader consensus in any given community, you can actually come to some kind of agreed upon story, which probably would have a lot in common with those from other parts of the country, if you can sort of get beyond the national politics. How to do that, I can't really tell you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mentioned before that for the first time in American history, it seems to me we no longer have a common sense of purpose of why we are living together in a single political community. And what you are raising is kind of a manifestation of that. We can't tell stories that everybody accepts as a good story. I ran an essay Luke had mentioned the American interest. One of my favorite essays that I ever ran in 14 or 15 years of that magazine was an essay by the late Charles Tilley from Columbia University. Stories of Credit and Blame. That was the name of it. Stories of Credit and Blame. The stories we tell, especially to younger people, but even to ourselves, the stories we tell constitute the metaphorical glue that keeps us who we are as one people. And what you're pointing to is that we don't have stories of credit and blame that are widely shared anymore in this country. You might really take an interest in how Professor Tilley went about posing this question, because I think it was really a brilliant piece of work. I think it's possible to transcend these things by looking to the future rather than to perseverate over the past. We can't change the past. We can change history. We can change how history is taught. But I think what we can, to me, the best way to get out from under this entanglement that we're in right now is to focus on the future. All right? What do we want this country to look like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What can we find in common that we want to build, that we want to have? So I think changing the focus from this mostly futile argument about the past into a collective argument about what the future should look like is the way to do this. And partly that's a matter of leadership, partly that's a matter of various kinds of social skills that organizations like Braver Angels and others can do. But I think we have to look forward, really. And one of the things that I'm encouraged by, I think you mentioned it before, it's harder to do these things at the national level, where people don't have a lot of face-to-face interaction content. Instead, they're relying on the internet. And one of the real problems with the internet, the stuff that goes on social media, is that it's anonymous most of the time, right? If people knew your name, right, when you talk shit about other people, there'd be a huge difference than when you can do it anonymously. So the anonymity of the social media world is a huge problem. I think we need to get back to more local, more face-to-face, focus on the future, and I think that's the way out of the mess that we're in. Now, how do you do that? I mean, I'm not a social organizer. I really, don't know the nuts and bolts of how you do that, but I think that's the direction. And I think also, lastly, I'm a great believer in subsidiarity. I think the federal government is way overweighted toward the center. But there's responsible subsidiarity, and then there's nativist, lunatic chowderhead subsidiarity, like we see, for example, in the Florida thing is just amazing. I mean, some of the folks in Florida around the governor there seem to me to be so clueless that they don't even realize that when they say, quote, "Don't say gay," you have to say gay to say don't say gay. When are they going to realize how nugatory and self-contradictory this is not the way to get anywhere, right? With basically stigmatizing and demonizing groups of people in the country. The way back to a national unity, the way back to common stories that we can tell each other and believe them, is to focus on the future.
So if anybody here is interested in writing the Federalist number 10 Frontier Thesis Interpretation of American Identity and American Historiography, you know exactly who to talk to for advice on how to start it. So let's take a last question from Frank. Frank?
All right, so, we've been talking a lot today about polarization. So I'm curious at what both of you would say. What is it that we're polarized about? Because to me, I don't know the answer, and I've been struggling with this. It's obvious that we're more polarized than we've been about anything. And I don't know what it is exactly that we're fighting about. Like, what is it? What is the line? What is the issue that it is? And the subsidiary part of that, which was, Adam said something that I thought was really, really wise. And it was that we lack a national project right now. And that what's dividing us in part as a people is we have no unifying project. So as part of that, like, if you had to create and define what the national project ought to be, like, what is the national project that we're neglecting? What should it be?
This is a great question to finish off on.
So I'm gonna fall back on my first book. I wrote about King Brewster, who was the president of Yale University in the 1960s and 70s, and really took the university from being what he called a finishing school on the Long Island Sound for WASP, largely upper class males from a handful of prep schools, and turned it into a national, in fact an international institution that stood for academic excellence and drew upon all of the talents of the country. And it was sort of a gradually widening draw on that talent, first extending to people from less socioeconomically privileged backgrounds, And the institution of need-blind admissions was a major landmark in that process. And then 2 different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and women as well as men. And I think this is part of the national project generally, to look at our institutions and try to reconcile the past and the present. Because Brewster's failure, actually, was in mobilizing what I call this second wave of meritocracy. He thought that he would take these people from different backgrounds, you would bring them these kind of institutions, you would inculcate them the sense of responsibility that at its best the old American WASP aristocracy did display, and then send them forth to do the same, to look after other neglected parts of the country in whatever sphere it was that they happened to occupy. And that's not how it turned out. What has happened is that increasingly meritocrats, if I can use the ugly term, feel that they have earned all the advantages they have. They're out to get as much as they can, and they're going to keep all of it.
Pass it down. Pass it down.
Yeah, but they'll pass it down to their offspring. But they will very rigorously make sure that those offspring have all the advantages they can get, which leads to the creation of lots of moats in American life, as the term comes from Richard Reeves in his book, The Dream Horse. And part of what drives the Trump reaction, I won't say all of it, but some of it, is the sense of people without college degrees, because that is the lead division, I think, in American life now. People who tend to be from the rural areas and the left behind post-industrial towns, that they are looked down upon and despised by a self-serving elite that does have these college degrees, that these people are rigging the economy as well as the culture to their interest, and that they have contempt for the people who are left behind. And the Democratic Party, which once upon a time was the party of the working class, and would have known better than to do this, I think, increasingly reflects the priorities of an increasingly ideologized college-going class. So, I think we've seen other societies that have done a better job of approaching this. The one I'm thinking of most is Germany, when it absorbed Eastern Germany, which was much more economically disadvantaged, and it's disadvantaged in so many ways after decades of communism, into West Germany, and it actually extended massive subsidy and reconstruction, in a sense, the Strukturwandel, to the east. And it has not had all of the impact that you might hope, to the extent that the AfD has any kind of geographic home in Germany. It does tend to be in the east. But the AfD is excluded from the political process. It's not that the Christian Democrats are making alliances with the AfD, and it's not that they're dominating in these areas either. Actually paying attention to and trying to integrate these regions has had a big positive effect, I think. Boris Johnson in Britain was trying to do something the same with leveling up for the northern regions. He did not stay long enough to have an impact, and I'm not sure how serious he was to begin with. But this is an obvious project for both the Republican and the Democratic Party in this area. We cannot have this kind of terrible separation, and it's in keeping with the ideologies of both parties to try to level up in that sense, to make sure that the opportunities are extended to all Americans, that no one is left behind because of their identity or their region or anything else like that, and particularly not their education. And I want both parties to be national parties that care equally about the people who don't vote for them as the ones that they do. And I think that actually everything about the American project would work better if first one and then hopefully the other party would take this kind of what used to be called one nation conservatism in the Disraeli side, or one nation Democratic Party on the other.
I don't have much to add to that. I agree with all that. What are we polarized over? We are polarized over everything for its own sake. All right? Again, I don't know that I've been able in a very short period of time to make myself clear, but it's blood sport, it's entertainment. The model is essentially military, it's war. We have militarized our politics, and it's like a bloodlust for the sake of it. The substance of it is there. I mean, the question of we're talking about a lack of respect for whole sections of the country. I think that's really critical. I think Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016 with her deplorables remark. I think if she hadn't said that, she might have actually pulled out the election. But this idea of tenured elites looking down their nose and telling you you're a moral reprobate and you're not allowed to have the views that you have. I mean, this is really destructive of any kind of unifying, capacity building political party. So it's this attitude that people have about, it's my way or the highway kind of thing. And I think it gets very personal, and it gets very nasty, and it feeds on itself. I think that's what's more than anything else. We're not polarized over issues. I think we have a good examples we've already given of many areas where there's common ground and where that could be built upon. I think it's more visceral than that. We are polarized over the reified enemies that we have created, and again, it's the blood sport, it's the spectacle, it's the winner loser kind of mentality. It's to beat the other guy down. It's become a kind of a mania for its own sake. I think that's really what it is, and I think people just have to get off the drug of demonizing and creating enemies out of fellow Americans.
Let me go back to your descriptive on the piece too, because I thought that was so important. It used to be we would say, well, there's certain things that will bring us in common, like a pandemic. Well, we've seen what happened there. A war. Well, I wouldn't hold your breath on that one either. And at the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, when it was invaded by Russia, you saw sizable approval from the Republican ranks as well as Democrats for our assistance to Ukrainians' cause, Zelensky generally. And once the forces of tribal warfare get at this issue, suddenly you see Republican support dropping. Essentially, it's if the other side supports it, I'm against it. Now that's an old, long-standing habit in American life. It used to be that Protestants from rural areas supported abortion rights because the Catholic Church was against it. And that's the important thing. I mean, this is an old human thing. There's a sort of joke that a peasant in his barn rubs a lantern, out comes a genie, and the genie says, I'll give you whatever you want, except your hated neighbor's going to get twice as much as you get. If you get 100 gold pieces, he's going to get 200. The peasant thinks this is, I want to be blind in one eye. Yeah. We need to get beyond that. It's a very ingrained human trait, but I think we can get beyond it.
Frank, I don't have answers for you on that, but that is the biggest question too that I want to spend a long time with. And Adam and Jeff, I'm very grateful that you guys have given us a very good last couple of hours of mulling and reflecting on that question and many more on all this sort of thing.
Thanks, Luke. Thank everyone for being here. Really appreciate it.
So you have just been here in Braver Angels America's Public Forum event. We do these once a month here at the Hamilton Restaurant, and we have two coming up between now and June. On May 16th, we're going to be joined by Matt Continenti and Michael Kazin, discussing the specific ideological histories of either party. And on June 6th, we're going to be joined by Shadi Hamid and Pete Davis, discussing various questions of political economy and social vision on the contemporary American left. Additionally, Braver Angels' DC Alliance does a series of forums itself called the Solutions Exchange. And mark your calendars for May 4th. They will be doing an event up at the Tenley Friendship Library with our dear friend Philippa Hughes on some questions of what the arts can do in the questions of polarization. And in the meantime, between now and July, when many of us jet off to Gettysburg, we will be doing several workshops, debates, and socials over the course of Braver Angels' DC programming here. And then, meantime, Jeff and Adam, I will look forward to seeing you two in Gettysburg for the Braver Angels National Convention in July. If anybody is interested in figuring out what exactly this little movement of Braver Angels members around the country is up to, not just in DC but nationwide, I heartily invite you to consider coming as a delegate, either personally or institutionally, to the Braver Angels National Convention. Please come up to me after this, and we shall chat about that in just a moment here. But lastly, I'd like to, after having thanked Jeff and Adam, and let's also thank our two bartenders in the back, Sergio and Greg. And thank you to all the Braver Angels members, volunteers, and friends of ours around DC for having come here and having been interested in this work. Braver Angels is an organization that just does one thing. We sit around in a circle, talk about our feelings. We do it in a couple different ways. And when we have the opportunity to think about them in other ways, we take that opportunity, and that's exactly what the America's Public Forum program was started to do a couple of years ago. And now that it is an in-person event happening here in the heart of Washington, I intend to keep doing it in ways that bring in as many smart folks from all over the political spectrum, from all over the disciplinary spectrum, and with all kinds of great ideas on how we should best think about our divides, how we should best think about all the issues relating to our divides. Adam, Jeff, I am very grateful that you guys are as supportive of the Braver Angels project as you are right now, and I want to assure you that the intellectual implications of depolarization and longer-term questions of political theory, of political sociology, of historical thinking, and all of that are things that we are in this room and in rooms like this over the current time frame. We're setting the groundwork for new ways, I think, of thinking about American nationhood and the American experience, and I'm grateful to have been a part of it with you guys here. So, with that, I will look forward to seeing you all at the next Braver Angels event, and if you're looking to get involved, please come up to me at the end, and I will look forward to chatting with you about how you can. Also, just for the record, Braver Angels is not currently thinking about setting up the Killer Angels paramilitary unit. So, I'll see you all sometime soon. Happy springtime. I thought you